Downward dog is a very famous yoga pose, and it's given in most standard yoga classes as part of sun salute or vinyasa yoga. And many people do that on a frequent basis. But I want to tell you why you should reconsider doing down dog. Down dog and many other yoga poses put weight on the hands, and that can lead to a lot of compression in the median nerve and other vulnerable areas of the hand and finger, and especially the thumb joint. Downward dog isn't the only yoga pose that could be problematic, especially for people with repetitive strain injury. This could include handstands or crow pose or table pose or cat pose or any number of yoga poses that involve weight bearing on the hands. Listen to what Dr. Robert Markison has to say about bearing weight on the hands.
But if you do a push-up, then you go from a position of function into a palm down position. So you've already taken and twisted, you've lengthened the muscle tendon units, flexors and extensors, so they're not going to work well under load or repetition. There's a bell-shaped curve called a Blix curve that dictates ideal muscle fiber length for best function, bearing loads, tension development, and so on. And so as soon as you transgress the Blix curve by twisting, you're going to start to fail. Then when you start to extend the wrist, you can crowd the carpal tunnel. If I extend the wrist with a crowded tunnel, then I'm going to risk worsening existing or perhaps causing carpal tunnel syndrome, too much crowding into an unyielding fiber and bone tunnel. And so that's a problem. The thumb was not really intended to be in a flat plane with the rest of the digits. Furthermore, 1 pound here registers 10 to 12 pounds here. It's called force couple. It's an amplification of load. So as you're pushing down with that thumb, this vulnerable basal trapeziometacarpal, carpometacarpal joint is threatened. And a lot of people don't like that because 25% of people over 50, especially women, can have radiographically visible arthritis. You go flat-handed with pressure, that's risky. Now, as far as the bones are concerned, you've got a marvelous complex of 8 carpal bones, carpus Latin for wrist. And the most vulnerable is scaphoid and lunate, scapho-lunate. You've got this incredibly complex ligamentous system holding the bones together. You've got 1 row of bones, a 2nd row of bones, proximal, distal, carpal rows. And the scapho-lunate joint, if you're loading that by driving a wedge-like capitate bone between scaphoid and lunate, that's risky because some people naturally have ligamentous laxity. Then you drive that through, you've got trouble. And yet there's another problem potentially where you may have the microcirculation of these small bones compromised. And the famous avascular necrosis, meaning literally falling apart for lack of blood flow, Robert Kienbach, 1910, described wasting away of this bone where it can collapse. Now, that doesn't happen often. I mean, it can be aggravated either by loading force, circulation, or a combination of factors. But if you have a fragile marginal circulation pattern, why would you stress it unduly with that palm down, wrist loaded position?
Does this mean that you can't do yoga if you have RSI? Absolutely not. There are many yoga poses that would be very healing for repetitive strain injury. I teach yoga teachers what they need to know about repetitive strain injury so that they can prevent further injuring their students. And it's interesting because a lot of the things that they give are things that they have been taught. And those could include things like doing the down dog pose up against the wall so that you're not putting so much weight on your hands. But what they may not understand is even that little bit of weight, which feels completely comfortable to the teacher, could be excruciating for somebody with repetitive strain injury. So there's so much to know. And what you want to look for is a teacher who really will take the time to understand you. I would recommend someone who would ask you, do you think this would be too much for you? And completely avoid weight bearing on the hands. That would be a really good start with the teacher, but you really want someone who will not push you. I would also highly recommend that you avoid group classes. And I know it's a lot of fun to take a group class and you enjoy the company of your fellow yogis. And that's really wonderful, but that can also include a lot of peer pressure. you may have to lie in Shavasana for most of the class because everybody else is doing a vinyasa, and you really shouldn't be doing that if you have RSI. It's just so tempting to want to keep up with your classmates and or your teacher. You want to be able to do what they are doing, but that could mean that you're not paying attention to your own needs or your own sensations, and that can really lead to further injury, which nobody can afford. You really don't want to go to a yoga class and further injure yourself in it. So I highly recommend that you interview your teacher first. Use your own gut instincts about whether you think they would be willing to really take the time to learn about repetitive strain injury, and most of all, learn about what you can and cannot do. And this can also change. Someday you might be able to do a pose, but the next day you can't. So it's best not to have a set plan where you're planning to progress and to advance to the next level of the pose when that could injure you. You need to let go of goals of reaching a certain point, because this is not a good plan if you have a chronic injury like repetitive strain injury, where things can vacillate and the littlest too much can set you back in recovery. Remember, the first rule of yoga is ahimsa. That means do no harm. Don't hurt yourself. So pay attention to that rule, honor that rule. I will be teaching more about yoga and RSI in future episodes, but in the meantime, be sure to watch the one that's coming up right now.